Hello, everybody, and of course, even if you don't have a body. I'm a Layman Pascal, and this is the Integral Stage Author Series, or at least it sort of is. We originally set this up to discuss Brian George's book, Masks of Origin, but for various so-called reasons, this chat has been delayed, and now, while we will certainly discuss Masks of Origin, this is likely to be a broader discussion of his writings, attitudes, and character more generally, as well as a way for he and I and you to get to know each other. So, who is Brian George? Why does he have two first names? What has he written? Where does he think creativity comes from? What are his complaints about conventional consciousness? And just how enslaved is he to the dark old ones who I'm told still rule this world from beyond time and reason? Let's find out. Hi, Brian.
Hi, good to meet you.
Before we do anything, where can people buy Masks of Origin?
It's published by Untimely Books, so you can go to the Untimely Books page that has a couple of buying options, either through Untimely Books itself, or if that doesn't work for some reason, it's available through Amazon. And there are some comments from different writers and other people on their response to the book, give you some sort of a general idea.
Perfect. Masks of Origin has this strong autobiographical weave through it. It sort of does this mythic thing where it works history and psychology and autobiography and a variety of genres together. But the autobiographical component intrigued me. And I wondered if, as a way to get to know you, you might want to go through a couple of the events in the book or just a couple that you remember from your life. Like, what are some key moments that you recall in your story that formed you, gave you insights, made you into the guy who's written these things now?
So, yeah, the book is an exploration of key spiritual and creative turning points. It's not really a normal memoir in any sense, because it's written from a dual perspective. On the one hand, I present things more or less in terms of the way I experience them from the inside out, from the viewpoint of a person from a particular time, family, and culture. But there's another aspect of the book where I'm experiencing things from the outside in, from the vantage point of some alternate aspect of the self, however that might be defined. We tend to think of the self or the ego in terms of it's being like one particular thing with a location. But that's not really the way a lot of ancient cultures experience things. I mean, there is the personal self, the persona, let's say, in ancient Greece, but in that tradition, it would be juxtaposed to the daemon. And a lot of other ancient traditions as well, the Zoroastrians have an Urvan and a Pravati, like a personal self and an aspect of the self that stays, in a sense, kind of at the edge of time, not necessarily before time in a state of complete unity, but with a much deeper memory and vantage point than the personal self. Egyptians, spoke of 9 aspects of the soul. Kabbalists often speak of 3 souls, like a breath soul, a blood soul, and kind of a group soul for humanity. Even though we're connected to things beyond that, those are the 3 souls that we primarily work with. In terms of more immediate traditions, the Yoruba from West Africa speak of an Ori and an Apori, like the personal head and the primordial head. And that's still very much of a current way of thinking in leukemia. My kind of view of this opposition has been there from a very early age, but the idea of how that might be tied into a personal destiny was clarified when I met my wife in the mid-90s. The same year that I went through Shaktipat, 1990, she experienced an initiation as a priestess of leukemia. And the idea of divination and destiny to bring you into alignment with some sort of a pre-existent story. Destiny is a kind of a very heavy, fancy word, and most people don't really think of themselves as having a destiny. I mean, that's something for Napoleon or whatever, or maybe psychotic who thinks he's Napoleon. But I think from a kind of a larger vantage point, everybody does have some sort of a pre-existent story that can be envisioned before birth, that comes back kind of in a rush on the edge of death, with certain key turning points that are there from the beginning, even though they can be manifested in a variety of ways. We can, ignore challenges and turning points when they happen, or we can move much more consciously into alignment with the idea of the personal life as a kind of story or a set of challenges. And to do that, I think it really demands a much more vital and conscious relationship between the personal self and however you would define that larger aspect of the self. So that in this way of thinking, the personal self, the ego, whatever, is not really just something to be jettisoned or transcended. It's something that just needs to be seen in terms of its original context. So that's one of the challenges in the book, to kind of stay, grounded within the personal self, within my immediate background in psychology, but also to experience that from the outside in as being a part of a, much larger set of interactive relationships. So the idea of masks, let's say, in terms of the title, Masks of Origin. The whole title is Masks of Origin, Regression in the Service of Omnipotence, which is kind of a hard title to explain, but it suggests that there's like a yearning for some state of, unbroken relationship to whatever existed before time, what exists beyond our normal perception of time and space. So that, one way to experience that is like a desire for some kind of power that we know we don't have. So that can manifest in terms of, let's say, attachment to a religion, fanatic devotion to a political cause. Somehow we know that we're partial, broken in some way, and there's something really yanking us towards a much larger alignment, but we often just don't speak the language correctly, and that ends up, that yearning ends up manifesting in ways that are pathological rather than restorative. So masks, I'm sorry.
The framing fascinates me in terms of regression, in terms of a return, right? It seems like we all are, the way we're built, it's very easy for us to feel an original condition and a fall and a return. Do you feel like that's the actual condition, or do you think that's just a shape that's necessary for us to access that condition, and it may well be a movement forward rather than a regress, or some other form of time in which those distinctions don't really apply?
Well, we often do think in terms of evolution, things becoming more complex, more perfect, more sophisticated. I had a paragraph in a recent piece that I published in Dark Mountain. I get into kind of an ongoing debate with my editor, Charlotte Ducan, about the use of the word we in relation to really anything at all that's happened over the past 200 years. But, I said something in the direction of, we imagine that, we're moving towards some greater, more sophisticated state, that all past conditions are somehow converging upon our iPhones. But anyway, at least since the Renaissance, there's been like an increased sense of forward movement, which is maybe a particular expression of the Christian sense of Christ coming at the end of time, or the Jewish sense of somehow history being a certain drama being played out that has a beginning and middle and an end. I tend to think in terms of recurring cycles. So it's really a question of where you want to place yourself, your point of awareness within that. So I do think that, there was or is a kind of a fall, in the sense of something that was originally whole being broken. But I don't necessarily see that as being a bad thing. Often it is presented as being like the eating of the apple, which leads to, the experience of good and evil, the expulsion from the garden. Or in Gnostic terminology, there's a pleroma, some state of unbroken fullness or illumination or knowledge that has somehow projected itself downward, either through the actions of Sophia, or then later through the powers of the archons, the demiurge, even the forces of the planets, which were I think, associated with the gods in ancient traditions for the archons became oppressive rather than divine forces. So it was almost like the stages, the layers of an onion. Each stage of creation was also a stage of oppression or contraction. And in Kabbalah also you have the idea of the shattering of the vessels, like an original state of originally nothing, then sort of the knowledge contained within nothing, and then the projection of that knowledge into a kind of visible illumination and creation of the spiritual and then material worlds. And then the idea that the vessels of creation, the Sephiro, although perfect in a sense, were just not strong enough to contain the original illumination. So the act of creation was also an act of destruction, a shattering of those vessels, a projection downwards, a kind of contraction. If you think of the original unity as being large and spherical, and then the earth is sort of like at the tail end of some process of demolition. But it can also be seen in reverse fashion, that aspect of destruction is absolutely central to the possibilities of creation, that there was actually maybe some flaw even in the original state of perfection, that in the Sufi phrase, I was a treasure that desired to be known, but the only way for that to exist was for that unity to be fragmented and for obstructions to be set up. So the whole idea of a world in Kabbalah, olam, simultaneously means something hidden, which other meanings of the word are eon, like a concavity of time, or something that exists beyond the horizon. So that we're sort of like projections through a series of slides that are distortions of the primordial light, but also the only means through which the light can come to fully know itself. So that kind of brings me back to the title of the book, with masks being obstructions, like something that we hide behind, but also expressions, the only ways that we can fully come to really experience ourselves, which I think is true for me creatively. If I were going to only write from a narrow personal perspective, which is the way many writers do, I'd probably be pretty tongue-tied. So I need to put on, even if it's an almost invisible mask that looks more or less exactly like me, I have to have some sense of surface to hide behind, some sense of persona that's organizing the creative forces of a particular poem or essay.
Seems like there's a couple of options in terms of how we think about the transpersonal being related to the personal. Like, one is this old idea that you can realize that and somehow escape from the personal to the transpersonal. One is that the transpersonal can be aware of itself as itself and wear the personal as a mask. Then another is that there's some possibility of the transpersonal and the personal fusing to the point that it no longer makes any sense to distinguish them. Which of those do you feel most drawn to? Probably not the first one.
Well, it's a drama that I've experienced probably from almost as, from the time that I really became aware of myself as being a separate being. Actually, there's a paragraph I'd like to read that said at the age of 4, when I first became aware of like a split within the self that I've kind of played with at different ways at different times.
Yeah, please read that for us. That'd be great.
I was very much aware, in at least maybe by the age of 6, my life kind of split into 2 parts. I was extremely happy as a young child. I just had a sense of kind of the air being golden. I'd wake up early, I would listen to the birds. I would lose myself in like making cities in the sand for hours and hours at a stretch. I had almost no sense of time. And even though I was aware of certain things not going well, there was almost no real sense of schism between myself and the world. My parents had separated when I was 4, and I could sense that something was a little bit off, but I didn't quite believe it. We had moved back to my mother's family's house in Worcester, and it was filled with relatives, though. They were great storytellers, always telling jokes. I could steal everybody's food, sort of the center of attention. So it wasn't really till the age of 6 when I started school that I really became aware of, much deeper split between myself and the world. But this was a very odd experience that stayed with me, that happened one morning on my back porch. It was just something that came and went, but it stayed with me just because it was so incredibly odd at the time. It was like another person altogether had kind of stepped into my awareness and then pretty much moved back again. One morning when I was 4 years old, I was sitting on the 3rd floor back porch of my family's 3-decker. It was 1958, and Worcester, Massachusetts was still regarded as the industrial heart of New England. Looking out, I could see smoke puffing from tall smokestacks, a freight yard and a railroad bridge, hills with houses perched on them that rolled into the distance, and a few miles off, on one of the highest hills, the Gothic architecture of Holy Cross College. How wonderful the day was. I could not have asked for a more perfect moment. My grandmother had given me a large chunk of clay. And then I was no longer looking out over Worcester. No, I was hovering above the Amazon, making snakes, canoes, and villagers out of the substance in my hands. As I worked, however, I became frustrated. It occurred to me that I had succumbed to a creative block. I grew angry. I could not believe what I was seeing. My hands were small. My mind just barely worked. My imagination seemed like a blunt instrument. I remembered what it was like to create real snakes and villagers. It's a particular way of saying something. Not necessarily that I was creating snakes and villagers, but some other experience of actually being over the Amazon and engaging on some supernatural level with what was below me just came back full force and kind of wrenched me out of what would otherwise be, complete satisfaction on a sunny morning, sitting on the back porch, making things out of a great block of clay. And anyway, that experience steadily intensified as I became a teenager, and kind of an ongoing both dialogue and war between these personal and less personal aspects began to unfold. I'm sorry, you were asking me, though, a more specific question.
I forget that one. What's interesting to me right now is we've talked a little bit about time and return in the sense of the relationship between the personal and the transpersonal. And then there's also within the autobiography of connecting with certain states and moments and a kind of hyper narrative that might be nested within the early moments of a person's own life. But there's also this possibility of historical regression, like to earlier civilizations, whether they be historical or imaginal, where we connect our feeling of how to discover these truths in life. Like, I'm wondering about you starting to live your life with these experiences. When do you start to connect that, if you do, with wisdom that you think has been passed down through generations to older cultures and the way that they approach these kinds of experiences?
I think to jump to another creative turning point, at the age of 16, something had changed. I had gotten kicked out of parochial school after political protest of the bombing of Cambodia. It's one of those things that seems sort of like a not particularly good experience at the time. I mean, I wasn't a particularly badly behaved student, but I also wasn't a well-behaved one. And I just decided, well, I don't really want to apologize. I think I was right. I was given the chance to stay, and I figured, well, time to move on. And probably saved my life. I finally managed to make it to a school on the other side of Worcester where I grew up. I had grown up in a working class neighborhood with pretty horrific schools. and finally ended up going to a good one in a more affluent part of the city. But that catalyzed a whole series of very abrupt, somewhat violent changes, which were spiritual, creative, intellectual, and some sort of energy began erupting out of nowhere. This was actually before I had taken any hallucinogens, so it wasn't necessarily connected to anything in that direction, but I felt like just this kind of hole had been ripped open in my stomach. Felt I was being swept by oceanic currents, and that the top part of my head had come off somehow. And so there was a sense of just being violently ripped out of myself. And the present moment, as I understood it until pretty recently until then, had just ceased to exist. I felt that something almost unspeakably ancient was trying to emerge. I had no idea really what that was or how to relate to it. And I experienced that challenge almost as a kind of violation. I felt that everything that I was seeing had become two-dimensional. I'd look out of my window at night and I would see the skyline, but it didn't really seem to exist in 3D space. I became obsessed with the idea of the facade. So I would look out of my window and I would see, like, say, factories and smokestacks in the distance. And I somehow became convinced that they were made out of cardboard, that they had no other side, that behind it was just like a kind of a spasming void or a heaving an ocean, or just like a depth of immeasurable darkness or energy. So it was very odd. I had the sense of overwhelming nostalgia that came on me very quickly, which was an odd thing. Nothing really externally had changed other than going to a new school, being more intellectually challenged, meeting some new people. But I had a sense that I had been suddenly projected like maybe a dozen years away from my childhood, which was just, a few months or a year before. But it was an odd kind of a nostalgia. On the one hand, I felt that like the solid earth of my childhood had just been yanked from beneath my feet. On the other hand, there was this sense of incredible yearning for something distant, luminous, and dark at the same time, unspeakably old, but not necessarily something that I was just seeing. I began reading Nietzsche at the time, and I was really struck by the idea that when you gaze into the abyss gazes back at you. That was the experience of something that really should be just sort of a landscape becoming fully alive and kind of coming towards me very aggressively, I guess. It wasn't something I wanted to stop, but I had no idea really what to do with it. I felt that some sort of a ultimatum had been issued, but I wasn't really experienced enough to even begin to understand what the ultimatum was. It was a sense that somehow I was being called on to act as some sort of a messenger or mediator, even though I didn't in any way have either the knowledge or the fluency with language to begin to rise to that demand at the time. But in any sense, I had pretty much quickly ceased to believe in the future as we imagine it, as a kind of shiny technological object. Even though as a child I was fascinated with, like the Apollo space flights, and my friends and I had set up kind of like a little space capsule in John Cienko's garage, and we stayed there for about 3 days listening to the radio and drinking Tang and kind of sleeping in our crinkly space blankets. We didn't really have any dependence on the media to speak of. We spent enormous amounts of time hanging out, camping, riding bikes, playing baseball. I think, that sense of having a childhood without much in the way of distraction and just doing physical things, whether it was, sports or camping or, hiking or bike riding or even just talking on a front porch for hours at a stretch, really was enormously valuable to me later on when I had a tendency to really become very spiritually ungrounded. But in any case, that's what happened at that age. I was just sort of like yanked out of myself in a way that pulled me out of my personal self, kind of out of sanity for a while, but also out of the normal reflex opposition between the past and the future. So that there was a sense that many things had happened in the distant past and deep time, of which we had become totally unaware. And I was somehow being called to remember things that barely even existed as dream images. But that was also the beginning of a much more dynamic relation with this other aspect of the self, which began appearing in dreams and as a voice sometimes audible in the back of my head, and also as just kind of a commandment to begin to do certain things, either both with visual artwork and also with poetry. And I journaled almost ceaselessly at the time, trying to figure out what the hell was going on.
What did you notice, if anything, about the process of writing itself? You're using it as a tool to try to make sense of, and then somewhere down the road, communicate these experiences and these other forms of self. What did it do? What did the use of that tool do for you? Was it successful, unsuccessful? Did it change the way you related to any of this to turn it into language?
Well, that really was my goal from an early stage on. There was a lot of, I guess you would call it, kind of late countercultural or mid countercultural spiritual ferment in Worcester at the time. A lot of new friends at my new school had already experimented with peyote, LSD, other hallucinogens. There was a sense of many things happening, breaking open spiritually, in that early Aquarian sense, but also of things being fairly dangerous. Since a lot of people really didn't know what the hell they were doing and took one too many LSD trips in party situations, and it kind of fried their brains or whatever. So even though I was very interested in moving in that direction as kind of an adjunct to what I'd already experienced, I was also very much aware of the dangers of spiritual psychedelic exploration. And religious cults had started to pop up all over the place, and they would have very attractive girls out in the street, on Main Street, trying to kind of lure you into conversations, and people hanging out in libraries, starting what appeared to be casual conversations, but were kind of oriented towards drawing you into some particular group. I had a conversation with a German architectural student who, for some reason, was in Massachusetts, and ended up with me being lured into dinner with the Moonies, and was kind of on the outskirts of Worcester. I had no way to get back home, and I kept getting into like increasingly loud arguments until about 2 in the morning, when I became so utterly obnoxious they finally decided to get rid of me. But I didn't really have a sense that there was anybody I could turn to in terms of like an actual spiritual teacher. I did have senior year speech teacher who served pretty much as a de facto spiritual guide and psychological counselor, but writing and artwork were really my only forms of therapy at the time, which was particularly challenging because I became very much aware of the limitations of my knowledge. I had gone from going to kind of barely functional working class schools, where the goal of educating students was pretty much one size fits all, and it wasn't necessarily horrible if you were like a normal student. I was a very peculiar student, and needed probably a much more individual kind of attention that just was not available for anybody. But one of the odd aspects of finally getting to a school that I loved, and meeting teachers that challenged me and students on the same wavelength, was that it made me feel incredibly stupid. So at the same time that I had a sense of almost, Promethean creative expansion energy, sense of spiritual dimensions, beginning to break open, I was also very much aware of being tongue-tied and undereducated. And so there was a, not necessarily an unusual thing, but like a veering between let's say, almost a kind of archetypal inflation or grandiosity, and just an awareness of total personal unworthiness. But there was no way really to put the two together other than visual work and early attempts at writing.
What sorts of things were you reading at the time?
Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Nietzsche, Pyramid of Unas text, Rig Veda, Pindar, Pico della Mirandola. Let's see, I made a slide list somewhere. So, Robert Bly, who came to Worcester because he was friends with Frank Quinn, who later became a poetry teacher of mine, began systematically going through all of the works of Young. The Clark University Library had the whole of the Bollingen collection, and just incredibly thirsty for knowledge. Most immediately, in terms of writers that affected me, I was very much inclined in a light symbolist, surreal direction. Was writing, I guess you would call it probably a kind of surrealist poetry, not very good surrealist poetry, but with decent models. I think Rimbaud at that point, because he was like my age, and was also involved in a kind of explosive process of exploration, was probably the most immediate model. I mean, I obviously couldn't write anything anywhere near as well, but there was one evening, I think, I can never remember if it was 16 or 17. I remember key turning points, but I often get exact dates a little bit scrambled up. I guess I was 17, but I had kind of like a creative explosion where I stayed up writing until about 5 a.m. and wrote about 16 pages of some probably totally absurd kind of spiritual, personal, mythological epic that was good just in the sense of being long and coming out with enormous force and involving the kind of, I guess, lateral leaps of association that would come to characterize my writing later on. It took me completely by surprise. But there was a sense of, sort of like riding a wave, or kind of just barely being able to pull things into focus, but my mind and my hands working just quickly enough to get them down. The problem I had, let's say, with peyote was things would just move too quickly. I would see enormous amounts, or my vision would really expand dramatically, but there would be a complete gulf between what I could see and what I could actually do. So my goal really from an early stage was to find some way to kind of physically, creatively manifest what I was seeing in very subtle states of awareness. And anyway, that one piece I brought to my cultural and intellectual history of Europe teacher, Sam Sleeper, who was a college professor trapped in a high school teacher's role. And he was both brilliant and extremely angry. And so he made me pretty much even more aware of the limitations of my knowledge, and found 2 lines that he really liked out of the 16. But weirdly, rather than being depressed about that, I thought, well, I really have, got to apply myself, and maybe I'll do something in a year or 2 that he might find to be more acceptable. So it was odd. At the same time, I was incredibly restless, and I guess still outwardly rebellious, both politically and otherwise. Experiences like that made me aware too of just the need for some kind of rigor, the need to really systematically apply myself to counterbalance that explosive creative energy with something much more deeply rooted and, I guess, rational, although I wasn't really thinking in terms of reason at that time. But I was aware very much of the need for kind of complementary aspects of intelligence. And, at that point, I could veer between could veer between one and the other without any real sense of what a working relationship might be.
You mentioned RIM mode, and if I remember correctly, the phrase that stands out, at least in my mind, is the deliberate derangement of the senses.
Right, yeah.
Attitude, right? And the word deliberate is interesting there, because in your story, you've been discovering these experiences, and sometimes they're rushing at you or being inflicted on you in a way. At what point do you start to think of it as a field of intentional or deliberate activity? I think maybe I could generate some of these experiences. Maybe I need an inner practice in order to engage with them in another way.
Well, the other odd thing that began happening a little bit into this process, I guess when I was 17, is that I actually felt the presence of some kind of future aspect of the self. I mean, there was, let's say, the kind of the aspect of the daemon, which was sort of outside of time altogether. But I actually began sort of like, almost like hearing myself in the present reciting pieces that I had written, almost like incantations or whatever. I could almost hear the words, not quite. I mean, I could hear the rhythm. I could kind of feel the subject matter. I could intuit the spaces that were being created. I could sense the kind of weaving together of forces that was going on, the kind of dynamic balance between opposites. So there was a sense almost of like some physical presence in the future, almost like a presence at the end of time, kind of a millenarian sense, but in a more personal way. A sense that there was like some little, almost like a center of gravity or luminous orb of some type, something that existed both as a presence, but also as a completed body of work. The idea of like an oeuvre, like a body of work. I think, does oeuvre also mean egg in French?
It can, I think.
I think. But anyway, sort of like a body of work that was kind of like an egg that existed in and of itself. Mm-hmm. I really began to have a sense that my work already existed in some way that was completely impossible to define, but I could hear it, kind of feel it, taste it, sense it as a kind of physical force that was pulling me towards it, as though everything in some way had already been accomplished. And I was just kind of too clouded to be able to really enact what needed to be said or done. So there's a line in one of my essays, the shortest distance between 2 points may turn out to be a labyrinth. So that's the way things pretty much unfolded, that I could really feel the presence of some larger unity, which was also not just a metaphysical unity, but the unity of a future body of work, some future psychic spiritual integration that was in some way reaching back for me. Again, it really played with my sense of time. It wasn't like a fantasy of like what I might be like when I'm famous or something. It was very visceral and also quite demanding and even terrifying, in that it allowed me almost no room to argue. I mean, I could sort of block that sense of being under an ultimatum out. I could just sort of engage in distraction, bad behavior of some type. But that really just sort of served to obscure what was trying to unfold. It didn't break the connection, and it didn't make things any easier.
So, do you think those are options? Could you have broken the connection, and could you have made things easier?
It's a good question. Probably not. In the forward to Massive Origin, I in a number of places and throughout the book, I compare my sense of having a personal story, let's say, which can be envisioned before birth, that functions as a kind of DNA. I compare that in some ways to a novel. So a novel, to some extent, already exists as a completed thing. It can be weighed in the hand. You can read it forward to backward, forwards, from the beginning to the end, in a way that, you're in the novel like the character, you're going page by page. You're aware of what's happened, but not necessarily what's going to unfold on the next page in the next chapter. But in some way, a novel also exists as a complete body. You could read it, if you wanted to, from the last word to the first. You could flip open to random pages to see what happened to come up. So I really have a sense that my life has been like that things have been very strangely interconnected. I'm very much aware of the possibilities of how even a single misstep can change the whole course of your life. For example, I was rushing to work at 6:30 one morning with 2 heavy bags on my shoulder. I tripped over a crack in the sidewalk and broke both bones of my wrist. I wasn't allowed to leave work for 8 hours because there was nobody to replace me. The wrist had swollen up to like 3 times its normal size. I had utterly incompetent doctors and no health insurance, and the wrist never healed well. And up until I had a corrective operation a couple of years ago, it was still giving me problems almost every day. I mean, the hand was usable, but just, there was always like a little bit of pain underneath that would sometimes come to the surface and sometimes almost disappear. It didn't really keep me from doing anything. The hand was strong enough, but it was just a reminder that, one split-second lapse of attention, and who knows what could happen. And the same thing can happen in a relationship. Things in early stages might be under a kind of like magic spell and everything goes perfectly and, you're getting along wonderfully and having great adventures. And then either you or the other person happens to be in kind of a mood one day, and then you end up saying like a few words, few sentences too many, things that can't be taken back. And then the cloud just sort of covers the relationship, and that you're experiencing the beginning of the end. So I'm very much aware of, how, each minute that goes by, we have like dozens of possible decisions we can make. Things are continuously kind of moving quickly into and out of manifestation. So it's an incredible challenge to figure out how that might fit together with some larger perspective in which things are very intricately tied together and waiting to happen, or in some sense have already happened. I might jump to another passage.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So this isn't specifically about creative process, but more about that sense of kind of clashing perspectives that somehow fit together in ways that really don't make any sense. This is from actually an essay in the book, The Snare of Distance and the Sunglasses of the Seer. If we were to leap tens of thousands of miles into space, the Earth, with all her continents and clouds and cities and roads and industries, would appear to be a blue and white marble. All life and death conflicts would be no more than abstractions. A tornado would be a kind of Sufi dance. A nuclear explosion would be the brushwork of an artist. In the foreword to Masks of Origin, I have suggested that time might exist this way as well, as something that can be experienced close up or at a distance. In this foreword, I compare a person's life story to a novel. In a novel, as in a near-death experience, all events are simultaneous. We could follow the story from one page to the next. We could also read from back to front, or we could open to a page at random. The novel is an object that can be weighed in the palm of one's hand. Like the Earth when viewed from tens of thousands of miles away, it exists as a self-contained volume. Viewed from the inside, the Earth is chaos, the fight for survival, human drama, many billions of overlapping choices every second. Viewed from the outside, there are the rhythmic variations of a shape. Viewed one way, time is measurable. Time is what is measured by a clock, as Einstein says. Viewed another way, it is a koan that stretches our intellects to the breaking point and then beyond. Time could also be imagined as a landscape, as a spiral, as a hypersphere, as the relation between an acorn and an oak, as a stage set, as a conjuration, as a snare, as a figure eight, as a labyrinth, and as an ocean.
So both life and books have this ambiguity about time, where they can be forward and or backward, they can be cyclic, or they can be always already completed. But there's this other ambiguity about the book, which is between the writer and the reader. So obviously, a part of your writing is to fulfill something you've already seen, you've already experienced, to change or articulate aspects of yourself. But what do you think about when you think about the audience for these? What, is there something like wishing to have an effect on the reader? And if so, what would that effect be, even given that that's only one of the interpretive aspects of this?
Well, that is something I've wrestled with quite a bit. I went through, when I was younger, when I first moved to Boston, I was lucky enough to kind of stumble into a circle of very challenging, mostly avant-garde writers. Again, something that easily could not have happened in the particular way it did. I was at a poetry workshop at Harvard, and I bumped into two people who would later become good friends, Jack Kimball and Don Quattrelli. And they invited me to a writers' get-together at 23 Joy Street in Beacon Hill the next night. Jack was a little bit on the abrasive side, and I was not really sure even whether I was planning to go. He was about 10 years older and was extremely confident to the point of being arrogant about his particular aesthetic approach. And he was complimentary, but made me very much aware of how young I was. And, he thought I had considerable potential, but, it was kind of on the edge maybe of something that could happen with the right guidance, which I found to be a little bit offensive. Anyway, decided to go anyway. I was in a very experimental mood and much more extroverted in those years, in the early days in Boston, than I was either really before or after that. And showed up at the time I was told to go, which I think was like 6 p.m. And nobody had arrived yet. One of the people who lived at the place, Will Bennett, opened the door eating a hot dog, even though he later explained he was a vegetarian. This large cloud of marijuana smoke billowed out, and he was standing there in a bath towel, and nobody else had arrived yet. So people began, trickling in probably around 7:38, and I had just cut my hair shortly before that. I had worn it pretty long when I was in high school in Worcester, and just got fed up with it, and I'd cut it, I guess, in kind of like almost a proto-punk fashion, but that was a little bit before the onset of punk in Boston. And people were still wearing it long. So anyway, I mostly just observed, and people were reading, fairly surreal work or kind of language poetry, or work that they almost all saw as being on the cutting edge. And at the time, there was a little bit of paranoia about like FBI undercover agents or whatever, and I was unknown to the group and had extremely short hair. So everybody was kind of giving me a very strange look, like, who is this person and why is he here and what is he up to? And finally, around 2 a.m, things had quieted down a bit, and I finally had a chance to read. And I began reading, and my style at that point was something that was almost like in the direction of Tibetan chanting. It was kind of like very slow and rhythmic and trance-like. And it had a very odd effect on the audience. People began like laughing hysterically and slapping the floor and throwing pillows around. And I had no idea what was going on until afterwards. I just kept going until it was over, and I thought, people probably didn't like it. Turned out to be the exact opposite. There was like some sudden release of energy. My work was so different from anything they had been expecting from somebody they thought might be an undercover agent, that it just created the sense of just kind of absurd, spontaneous release. So I was very lucky at that point to have people pretty much on the same wavelength who were all a little bit better than I was. And that circle lasted from about 1974 till probably the mid-'80s or so. But then went through kind of a long period of drifting away from the local literary scene. Just came to seem very claustrophobic and repetitive and self-indulgent, and felt that people were sort of fighting over small rewards. And I became much more spiritually focused and felt a yearning to study with meditation teachers and people who had much more of a sense of formal discipline than I did. And for a long time in the 90s, I was really working on my own. I began an incredible number of projects, particularly after receiving Shaktipat in 1990. It released just a nonstop flow of spiritual energy and intuition, and also verbal flow in a way that really couldn't be harnessed and was not really comprehensible to, I think, anybody else, and often even to me. For example, I had written one book, which finally is finished about a year ago, To Akasha, an Incantation for the Crossing of an Ocean, which came out of a series of experiences where I was experiencing kind of a world flood, but I was both in the flood and under it, and a part of various civilizations at different time periods in world history, but also kind of riding sort of on the top of a wave or a little bit over the wave, being carried through these different cultures and time periods. And the book, which ended up, current version is about 38 pages, is an invocation to Akasha. Appeared as a kind of personal tutelary goddess, but also as just space or memory in my understanding of it at the time. But it was a kind of desperate cry for my memory to be expanded and deepened. And it worked, but rather than forming any kind of a complete statement, the notebooks just kept piling up. At one point, they were actually about 10 inches high. And I had no idea how anything fit together. I just kept being given like more and more experiences, and verbal flights would, kind of sort of partway connect with other verbal flights, but nothing really cohered. And my girlfriend at the time, Kim, was terrified that I might actually make her sit down and read the entire thing. The little bit she read, she had no ability to or desired to understand. So that, was true of my work during a certain period. My wife, when we first met in 94, saw my poetry at that point as being a series of almost incomprehensible hieroglyphs. But then in 1998, my father died, and his third wife, Judith, my father and I hadn't grown up together. My parents had split up, as I mentioned, I think, when I was 4. And I saw my father maybe once a year till I was about 11. Then he disappeared didn't know it at the time, to Mexico to start a company and a second family. And I didn't hear from him at all till I was almost out of art school when I was 23. So anyway, when he died in 98, I thought we had achieved some sort of workable harmony. We didn't necessarily get along that well when we first got back in touch when I was 23. I was newly married and just out of art school. And it was wonderful to see him, but he was a high-powered businessman and thought I was completely wasting my time writing poetry. He said at one point that he had shown it to all of his most educated friends. And one of his friends, who taught at Yale, said it was a form of highly literate masturbation, which it might have been. But anyway, he kept trying to push me into going back to school to study business. And at one point it got so unbearable, I broke off all communication for about a year and a half. Then in, I think, 87, we got back together, and I was just grateful to be in touch. And I felt like it was just like a world of stuff to be explored and emotions to be worked out. And he wasn't anybody who really revealed anything about his emotions. Whenever I would try to get some little bits of family history or ask him about his own childhood or earlier ambitions, he had wanted to become a classical cellist. He would find very convenient ways to just steer the conversation towards anything else, towards a particular conductor he had heard at Tanglewood, or various trips that he had taken, or what his house looked like in Mexico. But then when he died, I realized there was just this incredible backlog of material that had to be kind of explored and integrated. And I really didn't want to give the eulogy, but Judith, his third wife, insisted. And it was almost a kind of sweat lodge experience or something. I was awake for about 3 days straight, just going through all of these memories and trying to put experiences together in my head and form words and then sentences and paragraphs, which was the only way that I'd finally managed to write some sort of a book out of that earlier invocation to Akasha. I just scrapped everything that I had written and tried to go with what I could actually remember, which is often that will often be the key images, the key experiences, emotions, whatever. So that's what I tried to do with the eulogy, and it worked. I was also quite sick at the time. I had a horrible cold that came on when I was on my way out to Denver. Could barely speak, so I was drinking tea constantly and trying to sort of prepare myself to give the eulogy, which finally went over really well. But that gave me just a whole different sense of what I was being called to do as a writer. I realized that I had left out just enormous personal dimensions to my work. I was focused on kind of rarefied creative and spiritual flights, but in a way that had left me kind of dangerously ungrounded. So that one experience probably was the kind of the birth of my career as a prose writer. A much more refined version of it is in Masks of Origin, like 2/3 of the way through the book. Then I had gone back to school in 2000 to get my teaching credentials. I had graduated from art school, but I felt like a strong desire to teach. I come from a family of teachers, and it seemed like a natural thing to do. And I was married to my second wife, and we had our daughter Liz was about 3 at the time. And then I had no choice really but to write tons of prose when I was in school, often about things I didn't particularly want to write about, and things like lesson plans that demanded very precise organization. But it was enormously valuable. And then teaching career didn't really work out. There were almost no high school positions open, and I ended up teaching junior high for a while, but I just am not very much of a natural disciplinarian. And I realized I had to decide, do I want to teach or do I want to write? Because it seemed really that there was almost nothing left at the end of the day. Then, probably starting in 2000, I began publishing every couple of months in Reality Sandwich, at a time that the internet was kind of like a shiny new thing and really wide open to possibilities of actual dialogue without too much in the way of interference from trolls. It wasn't very heavily politicized. And it was kind of a trial by fire in terms of actually writing in a way that I was able to communicate with people who wanted to read it, who might have been interested and sort of got the general idea, but lost a lot of things along the way. And so my process of revision since then has been to make things simultaneously clearer, more rigorous, and more adventurous at the same time.
I'm imagining that you actually were an undercover FBI agent this entire time. I would love to get to this list of creative virtues that you sent to me. But maybe before we do that, you could tell me what you think of when you think of creativity. What is creativity to you?
Let me read maybe another piece in that direction, then we can get to the creative virtues. So I have two pieces that deal with the idea of expressing the inexpressible, or the idea of the writer as world space. I don't know which one might be more appropriate.
Let's go with expressing the inexpressible. That's been on my mind lately.
Okay. We can maybe circle back to the other one toward the end. So I'm going to read the first section of an essay called "I Left at Dawn for the Eternal City. It Seems that I've Misplaced Several Days." The whole essay is up in 3 sections on online magazine called Scene 4, International Magazine of Arts and Culture, with a lot of artwork as well. Some of my artwork is up there. Anyway, this is This is a piece I added kind of toward the very end of the essay. I mean, first section in the essay, but it kind of sums up the challenge of writing in a particular way. Can one speak from beyond the place where language ends? I would do so. I have spent 5 decades in exploring and learning and testing how to do so. There are many who would claim that no such thing is possible. And even if it were, they say, this would not be a good idea. When I point out that there were, in fact, any number of poet-seers in the past, they argue that these poet-seers would back up their position. If I present them with an esoteric poem, they will say, this makes no sense. Why can't you just say what you mean? If I present them with a tightly argued but freewheeling visionary essay, they will say, this is prose. Everyone knows that prose cannot express the inexpressible. What is the poor poet to do? Should the seer see through someone else's eyes? He already tends to do this, but he is not any less disturbed. To whom does the poet speak? For whom should the seer see? Read only by a fraction of 1% of his contemporaries, uncertain of whether his city will soon be underwater, concerned with his daughter's happiness and safety, with the earth she will inherit. The poet must go where his vision takes him. He does not predict, he observes. He is often overwhelmed by the sense of having seen certain things before. If the wind blows, he must say, I have been there. If squeezed through a population bottleneck equal to that of the younger Dryads, he must again say, I have been there. If the silence is so loud as to be painful, if the earth shrinks to a point no bigger than an atom, if he is asked to speak in a language that does not yet exist, he must again say, I have been there. He must speak of what he sees, trusting, perhaps foolishly, that space itself has ears. Are his critics right to scoff at his pretenses? He is at least as aware as they are of the outer limits of language, of what it can and cannot do. His own poems sometimes fill him with disgust. His only option, to conserve his energy by pouring himself out.
I feel very close to that one. My attempts to express the inexpressible and my need to have been there. And it's interesting to think about, like, this is maybe a segue into the 10 creative virtues, is that you're describing a creative temperament or character there, right? There's a type of person who would hear that and resonate with it. It's not the majority of the population, but it is some particular seemingly natural minority of the population that's predisposed toward a certain kind of creative life, a certain kind of self-search. And then, yeah, I'm curious about how and why you feel driven not just to be creative, but to almost be a theorist of creativity at the same time. Right, you're looking at how it's constituted in creative types. You're looking at a breakdown of the qualities or characteristics that might express it or be able to increase it. Do you think of yourself as a creativity analyst in some respects?
I wouldn't use the word analyst. I try to write in a way, though, that's very tactile. I want to kind of take readers on a journey. Not just to convey information, to analyze, to describe whatever. Actually, I wrote toward the end of a list somewhere. Thought I did. Anyway, I think one confusion is that people really have a very limited sense of what language can do or what it's for. People think that language exists to convey information, to prove a point, to analyze, sometimes to express personal emotions, to tell stories. I mean, all of that's true. But I think it has, also far more primal functions to invoke, to exercise, to cast from a center, to call from a periphery. It has very primal world creating functions or world centering functions that really call into question our suspicion of language. I think it's often much easier for us to just say, oh, well, silence, spiritual expression is inexpressible, so why should we even try? All of the great teachers have told us that, the beyond is, beyond human comprehension. All words are inadequate. So those who don't know speak, those who know are silent. I mean, that's, something very often repeated, so often really it's become true. But I don't think it's really true in the history of spiritual traditions. Rumi, I think, his Mathnawi is the longest poem in the Persian language. The Mahabharata is, I think, 8 times as long as the Iliad and Odyssey combined. Blake certainly felt completely confident, whatever the limitations of his language, which is somewhat a little bit rickety, but felt fully confident to convey a very, certainly to the people of his time, obscure cosmology in very ambitious terms. I think often it's just, it makes us kind of aware of our smallness, of our awkwardness, and stirs up, I don't know, just things we don't want to acknowledge in ourselves, certain limitations, certain unresolved conflicts. But I think our reasons for not wanting to express the inexpressible are in themselves somewhat suspect. One thing I greatly appreciate about your work is just your incredible recklessness and playfulness and sense of humor in trying to do that. Your, delight in contradicting yourself, your, wonderful kind of expansive at homeness with paradox. Very often people will talk about paradox or non-dualism or kind of reclaiming certain capacities for language. Like when I used to write for Reality Sandwich, people were constantly theorizing about altered states of awareness or return to the primordial kind of expanding into the noosphere or whatever, but they would always do it in just incredibly boring, predictable, flat-footed academic and journalistic prose. And one thing that really delights me about your work is its sense of play, that, you handle terminology in a way that I, couldn't even begin to attempt to equal. You're very much at home in, both traditional and, contemporary philosophical and spiritual traditions, and can play with terminology in the same way that, I might play with just surreal images. But you also do it in a way that's without like heaviness or claustrophobia. You're not necessarily indebted to systems. You're trying to see, what a system might offer you, how it might connect to other systems. But there's always a quality of kind of dancing mischievousness to your work that I'm just beginning to really explore. I mean, I've only known about your work for a couple of months, and the deeper I go into it, just the more invigorating it becomes.
Well, I very much appreciate you saying that, because those are qualities that really earn my respect and arouse my interest in the writers that I favor. Nietzsche was one of those in terms of being really spiritual and critical and musical and light-footed and acrobatic all at the same time.
There's such a misunderstanding of Nietzsche, I think, particularly because of association, due to no fault of his own with Nazism. Actually, during the period of his insanity, whatever that comprised of, he called on Europe to declare a preemptive war against Germany and ordered Kaiser Wilhelm to go to Rome to be shot.
Yeah, he's pretty resolutely pro-Jew and anti-German in quite a lot of the writing.
And, pro-Mozart, anti-Wagner.
Yeah. Well, that was always one of the things that fascinated me the most. I've written about this a little bit, but I grew up in a time when classical music just seemed like one homogenous, old-fashioned thing. And it wasn't until reading Nietzsche, I'm like, oh, someone could be passionately in favor of one and against the other, in favor of Bizet and opposed to Wagner, right? I didn't even know what to make of a conflict like that. There was so much I needed to learn to be capable of even knowing what the sides in the battle were.
But because I was approaching Nietzsche from kind of his public image, I was really shocked to discover the conflict with Wagner, who was a friend of his, at least at the beginning. And his love of Mozart I just would not really associate with Nietzsche. But, there is that conflict, or not conflict really, but that weird juxtaposition in Nietzsche of lightness and heaviness, of the idea of incredible depth, but also like dancing on the surface of the ocean.
Yeah, his need to try to find that lightness, to try to convert his heaviness into a lightness that would make himself bearable to himself, and that written as a journey across his books. That really, I resonate with that.
But yeah, he was a major influence on me as a writer, partly just the incredible incisiveness and energy of the style, but also his love of paradox. I've often gotten into conflicts with editors who want me to refine certain points I'm making the way you do in, like writing a essay for graduate school or whatever. You have to be very careful about defining all of your terms, and then you have to very cautiously qualify something, then qualify your qualification. I had written an essay for my friend Peter Gerstein about his exhibit with Carolyn Neuberger a couple of years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. And he'd wanted me to write something initially just for a short gallery statement, then it expanded into a catalog. And we were finally able to get it posted on Scene 4. That was when I first discovered the magazine. But although he provided invaluable creative feedback for what turned out to be like a 13-page essay, he kept wanting me to overqualify points. He's a librarian at Harvard, and he takes exactitude very seriously and really believes in being very specific about everything that he says. But my own sense is that you really lose more than you gain by being overly fussy as a prose writer. I much prefer, actually it's something that you do, to kind of state something fairly boldly, and then maybe state something in a very different way, even that contradicts it. And then sometimes just let the reader find their way between the two positions, or, go on to kind of very subtly weave between them, or even jump to a third position that refers back to them without necessarily being an immediate synthesis. But I like to leave gaps in my writing that will serve as kind of creative prompts. So there's a lot of sentences that might at first be maybe a little bit needlessly obscure from some people's vantage points, but that are really intended to function as catalytic prompts or koans, as kind of calls to leap from one mode of awareness to another.
The finicky editor thing reminded me of an article I wrote for Revision magazine, I think last year, but there was a long back and forth about my use of we, trying to very clearly specify.
That just happened to me.
And I get the point they're making, and I was willing to clarify, but I'm not sure that was an improvement to the sensibility or the tone or the rhythm or my satisfaction with the orchestration of those words.
No, that's so funny because, one of the pieces that I just published about a week ago in Dark Mountain, I get into a long running debate with Charlotte Ducan, my editor for the piece, about my use of the word we. I didn't want to be overly specific in the way that I used it. And I was referring to like what we have thought over the past couple of 100 years or whatever. And she thought it was way too general and wanted me to like define it more specifically, but then she wasn't really happy about the way I defined it. And I was like begging her, let's just stick with the use of the word we. And people can find their own relation to it. I don't really want to define it in terms of us versus them or various subgroups or oppositions. Readers can be trusted to make certain judgments, to decide how much they want to identify with a particular position, for or against. And I don't like writing that's overly fussy. I like writing that can be extremely refined, but that's also very bold. One of, yeah.
I like the boldness. And I also think there's when something similar to trance or something similar to state change is part of the communication of a piece of writing, then there's a role for certain kinds of vaguenesses and ambiguities in that. Right? You were telling the story of reading that poem and having it exert a kind of trance-like effect on people, partly because of its structure and partly because of your reading. But when a person does inductions in hypnotherapy, say, it's a special arrangement of words, and part of the particular thing you're going for is a certain suggestiveness that sometimes needs to have less precision or less anchoring or less structure in order to do its job.
No, I think that's, one thing that people really don't get, particularly these days. I mean, I think people were more open to it, like when I moved to Boston in the 70s, because people were actually sitting in rooms or bookstores talking to each other, reading poems to each other. Time really was very different. We're so used to being like continuously absorbed and distracted and going from one thing to another. It's really the complete opposite of the way I grew up. Yeah, it's one thing I guess we'll get to in the creative virtues, but the capacity to kind of actively do nothing to me is so central to creativity. And it really has to do with communication also. If you're kind of rushing to get through a piece or just scanning for information online, not only are you reading in a different way, your whole body is different. Your brain functions in a different way. You just can't process information in any way at the same depth or with the same sense of, relation to various parts of the body. Even just holding a book in your hands, I think, creates a very different reading experience than scanning for information, even if it's exactly the same information online.
There's an additional element to the digital form, at least, Facebook, Twitter, and things like that, which is the prompt for immediate evaluation. So like I find if I write something, people will scan the first sentence, look for the theme, and then give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, because they're structurally prompted to quickly provide evaluation feedback. So there's not only no time to process it, but you have to put your processing brain aside and try to make a judgment of it right away.
I think there are good and bad ways to do that, though. For example, my wife and I, actually for almost 20 years, we first were part of a group of revolving salons. We call them salons, just as kind of a general term, but it would be gatherings of writers, artists, and musicians, beginning initially just with a group of friends who all had adult jobs and wanted to, kind of maintain their creative energy. And we would meet at each other's houses and, revolve the salon between different locations. So that began fairly small and just with a kind of an intimate group. But in 2011, my wife and I began hosting a kind of a more expanded version of it. I had been working as a organizer for Evolver Boston from about 2008 to around that time. But it was like herding cats or pushing a string. There were theoretically all sorts of people very interested in let's say world transformation as a general term, but new states of awareness or whatever, new possibilities of group organization. And I met incredible numbers of, very creative people. I mean, mostly writers, artists, musicians. But there was also an attempt at central organization, or even on a worldwide scale. So each month there would be separate subjects that we were supposed to address. I mean, the goal was to bring together, to weave together groups already in existence. But I made a list of some of the different subjects that we covered, but we would lurch from one to the other. So the urban gardening, the gift economy, intentional communities, alternative health, climate change, ancient mythology, psychedelic shamanism, the relationship of technology and the psyche, the noosphere, the Mayan calendar, reincarnation, polyamory, trance states, crop circles, and UFOs. But let's say people involved in political organization would have absolutely no interest in UFOs, or people involved in urban gardening would have no interest in ancient mythology. So we might have like 40 people for one group, if we were talking about contemporary Brazilian shamanism, and the next one, say urban gardening or whatever, there'd be 6 people. So there was just no way to really maintain forward momentum or to actually create like a real energetic body out of these diverse theoretical elements, as well intentioned as the effort was, and as amazing as the people were. There was just no natural cohesion. But one other problem was that people were just not used to doing things in physical time and space. This was already at a time when people were living kind of more than half of their lives online, although it's gotten even more dramatic since then. And the idea of just being like together for a long time in a room, kind of figuring out what to do and how to, organize the group, or, stages that had to be followed. People would often just kind of veer into these grandiose fantasies, and I would keep trying to bring them back to something doable, small, what to do next week. How does this actually fit with that? And it never would work out that way. So I never wanted to be the one person in charge. I always wanted to be like second in command, because I really was aware of the potential for burnout with that kind of organization. I was involved in a high school underground newspaper when I was a senior. We had about 40 meetings, and by the end of it, we hadn't even decided on the title for the newspaper or put out a 4-page copy. We had lots of fun, at the meetings. But so anyway, after kind of the impending burnout of the Evolver experiment, my wife and I decided to refocus the idea of the salon. So I kind of collected kind of the most creative people from the Evolver experiment, writers, musicians, artists, and integrated them with our existing group of friends. And then people were also invited to kind of open up the group at the edges. We were trying to keep it to a coherent size, though. It would usually go between about 15 and 26. But I found that to be like probably the only size group that I really want to be involved in. Something really on a human scale where everybody knows everybody, that is open at the edges, kind of like the idea that you would find in some African societies, where you would have an almost complete enclosure, but one part open to the bush. So we would always be bringing in new people, but also maintaining a certain coherent energy with the people already in the group. But one thing that we really wanted to experiment with was just sort of bending or even breaking people's sense of time, getting them out of the kind of the distraction economy. So we would often begin the event about 5, and we would have food that everybody could bring, although we'd often have a lot of our own set out. Be food in the dining room with, some wine or whatever, and people would just sort of gather and socialize and talk for about an hour. Then we would start the event with instructions, which were pretty important, that people would have 10 minutes to present, then there'd be like another 5 or 10 minutes for feedback. But we didn't want any kind of rush to judgment. We didn't want any harsh critiques or, people saying, well, that's all very well and good, but this is the way I would do it, which is often not the way artists or writers typically respond. So the initial goal was just to say, well, this is what I saw, this is what I heard, this is what I felt. Then, you can ask questions of the person who presented. But the idea was to keep it fairly soft and non-judgmental, and so that opinions would gradually arise out of the interaction, but not so much that people would sort of just immediately impose their own viewpoints, much more that the insights would arise out of the process of questioning. And it worked. We continued right up until the pandemic. And unfortunately, whenever we make plans, there's like some new variant that seems to pop up. But events anyway would begin about 5. They would really get going about 6:30. People would, kind of come and go depending on their work schedule, or if they were, coming out of some other event earlier in the evening. But the events would often go on with little breaks for, food or whatever, sometimes until like 12:30, 1:30 in the morning. but with no sense of any of the restlessness that you would normally expect with that kind of time period. Like I could never probably sit through a 6-hour movie now the way I might have been able to back in the 70s, when directors were experimenting with filming somebody sleeping for 6 hours or whatever. But yeah, people would move into a much, well, not necessarily even that much older sense of time, but the sense of time that I grew up with, the sense of time I experienced, let's say, when I was 4 or 5, I lived in a house, 3-decker full of relatives. And in the evening, people would sit out on the back porch and just talk and tell stories for about that length of time. Like they would go out after supper and, stay up until like all of the traffic died away in the background. And, maybe around midnight or a little bit after, finally begin to wind things down. But people had no expectations of being like enormously entertained, or no like desire necessarily to kind of rush a person to the end of the story. There was just a sense that, each person would have something to contribute. Things would have kind of a natural rhythm of rising and falling. With an organized salon, it's a little bit different because people at the beginning would sometimes want to kind of monopolize attention. So you wouldn't want somebody like reading or, playing or whatever it happened to be for 45 minutes at the beginning. And then people at the end would, be squeezed into like 5-minute slots. So it was a little bit tricky to kind of organize things without seeming dictatorial. But, as events went on through the years, it, particularly with people that were used to the format, it became very, very natural. And, sometimes things would, go a little bit over or whatever, but it really felt like a kind of organic way to do things. And you would move into really an altered sense of time without anything being forced.
So you set up these loosely structured intersubjective containers where people underwent a shared modification of their sense of regular time. And, in terms of segueing back to the creativity list again, do you think this made them more creative as individuals? Do you think it raised a collective creative energy?
I do. Yeah. I mean, from what people said, and often, well, it's the way I tested out my own work. I would often, revise a piece 10 times and have been working on it very intensively up until the evening of the salon. Then I would read a piece and I'd be 2 lines in and go, oh no. I mean, just reading it for other people. I mean, not necessarily even sensing any critical feedback, but just really hearing it out loud and sending your energy into a group and seeing the way it circled and came back, whether it like ran into any blockages, whether some people might just be tuning out, whether, certain things that might seem very challenging would just like sink into an incredible depth. Other things that you thought would be immediately accessible just, didn't connect somehow. But it's something I wasn't able to predict. It was really a kind of incredible workshop. And I think it really functioned in the same way for most of the people involved.
You know the term MacGuffin from cinema?
Remind me.
It's like the notion of an unimportant lure that draws someone in. So very famously at the beginning of Psycho, this woman's escaping with this money and we keep following the money and they're
right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But it turns out that had nothing to do with the movie. She's actually on her way to get murdered at a hotel. So there's this lure that draws people along. And I'm noting we probably have about 10 minutes left. And so I've been constantly prompting on this virtues list, but maybe it's just a MacGuffin. Maybe it's a trick because we don't need to go into it. It might be better to spend this last 10 minutes reading any other piece you wanted to share with us at the end.
That might be good. Let me actually read something that I had wanted to read to you just because I thought you would like it. And then I'm sure we can sneak in the top 10 creative virtues, even if we don't have
how much we can get in.
Talk about them. Actually, if people are interested in those, the reason I wrote them, I was doing a couple of interview sessions with Greg Kaminsky and Billy Hepper for A Cult of Personality. And during the second interview, they asked if I had anything that I wanted to offer readers in terms of suggestions for their own creative process or whatever. and I improvise these in about 10 minutes afterwards. But yeah, let me read another piece that I thought you would like. So this is, again, sort of an example of my attempt to combine creative process and yoga. This is another piece from The Snare of Distance and the Sunglasses of the Seer. The emptiness that is space shows no sign of disturbance. Space is, for there is no way for it not to be, yet no line divides what is from the depths of the non-existent. In this next to nothing, there is resonance. There is the hum of every incantation from past worlds. Each terror is an egg in the hand of a blind magician. Each neurotransmitter is a key that fits the lock of a missing door. Once the Kundalini hid its teachings inside forms, as a test of whose skill and camouflage they served, and from whose potency they had been created. We must later on help to free these teachings from their forms. We must break the Sumerian seal that turns us back from the catastrophic depths of our own breathing. Having once been set in motion, the Kundalini stirs up and expels a volcanic flux of images as it burns through every obstacle in its path. It rips continents like sheets of paper. It dismantles the prosthetic bodies of the gods. It unravels all of the complexes that defend us from our fears, leaving no means by which blessing can be sorted from disaster. It expunges every trace of the antediluvian records, all arts and sciences, yet without even a small detail being lost. But why is this necessary, you might justifiably ask? It is possible that it does things just to show us that it can. It is possible that the Kundalini simply likes to play. Or alternately, it is possible that our childhood is over, and that, finding ourselves cold and naked on the coast of a dead ocean, we must figure out how to grow up. Tertullian writes, I believe in the resurrection because it is impossible. So too, at the tail end of the Kali Yuga, if access to our first mode of vision would now seem to us impossible, it is for this reason that we must treat our abandonment as a test. Good vision may depend on our having nothing to lose, no cause to advance, no belief whose planks have not been shattered by a storm. At some point, cooling down, upon finding that there are no laws left to violate, the Kundalini may become much nicer than it was. Then, as smoothly as a bell tone through the zodiac, or as the arcing of a current through the ocean, it will move on to its predetermined end. Each atom will have 108 eyes.
Thank you, Brian. If people are listening from developmental theory communities, as I know you are, that's poetic, structural, developmental, multi-perspectival, transrational non-dualism. So that's pretty legit. And I love the image of the egg in the hands of the blind magician.
So, yeah, this gives you a sense of the tactility of my approach. I'm not really an analyst or a theorist, even though I deal in sometimes kind of large-scale concepts. I really want to present everything in a way that relates to my own body and that in some way, probes its way into the psyche and body of the reader or listener. Much easier to do, actually, like in a salon situation where people are physically present. Sure. And, I can also sink into my own energy and cast a kind of a spell.
So this is a bit of an artificial scenario to be on this device with each other. But what happens in your body when you read that?
Well, I'm just figuring out how to, live and, breathe in this format. So, I'm reading from like a more superficial level than I normally would in like a late night situation with, small salon group. But I'm having fun too. I mean, it's been really enjoyable to talk with you, and I'm profoundly grateful to technology on this particular scale, where it does allow for communication that otherwise wouldn't exist. I mean, I wish it wouldn't exist for so many silly purposes, but for me, this is, the one great thing that technology can do in terms of, introducing and connecting you to people that you would never really otherwise have a chance to meet.
Yeah, there's certainly something we can do here that we can't do with letters and phone calls.
So do you want me to try to squeeze in the 10 creative virtues?
No, I mean, maybe we'll include a link or something of those, but I sort of love the idea that they keep getting mentioned but don't get shown.
Oh, we can always talk again at some point.
Yeah, I would love that, because I feel like we're sort of slowly building a rapport, and I feel like the way we're having our conversation weaves in and out of normal structure of a recorded discussion. So that's something that feels like it has a future.
That's the way I experience things. You know, at this age particularly, my sense is things that seem to be very separate when I was going through them are all kind of very closely, paradoxically interwoven in a way that does form a kind of living body, but one that really has become more and more visible in retrospect. Anyway, for anybody who is interested in the top 10 creative virtues, my discussion with Greg Kaminsky and Billy Hepper will be at some point available on our Cult of Personality, and we spend a good portion of the last part of the talk exploring the creative virtues.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Brian. It's been a pleasure and an intrigue getting to know you better.
And just beginning to discover your own work and looking forward to, plunging much more deeply into it.
Okay, great. Let's come up with an excuse to talk again sometime.
Oh, definitely, even if it's not online.
All right. Bye-bye, Brian.
Take care.